Welcome to InnoEthics Live, hosted by Allegra and Daria, produced in conjunction with the InnoEthics Initiative and the Be the Change Media Network. On this podcast, we discuss topics within AI and emerging technologies, focusing on subjects such as governance and ethics, cybersecurity, privacy and autonomy in the digital world, and the impacts of emerging technologies generally. By combining a philosophical, humanitarian perspective with a technical, scientific one, the aim of the podcast is to discuss these global issues from a point of view that takes into consideration the many facets of these discussions.
Coming from different backgrounds, both on our focus subjects, but also from different countries, and having met at a conference that celebrates youth global cooperation, Allegra and I seek to empathize the importance of a global perspective on these topics. In our previous episodes, we discussed our opinions on whether AI can be our friend. In this episode of InnoEthics Live, we're going to be doing something different from usual. We're going to be featuring our first guest on the podcast. However, first, let's hear about this week's take on AI topics.
So as I discussed in this week's InnoEthics newsletter, or I guess when you guys were going to be listening to this last week's InnoEthics newsletter, I'm in the process of reading Deep Thinking, Where Machine Intelligence Ends and Human Creativity Begins by chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov. I am not very good at chess. I have tried to learn. I've read one book on learning it, and like everyone else in 2020 or 2022 or whenever it came out, was obsessed with the Queen's Gambit. My main actual entry into chess was through AI, because when I did my first piece of work ever on AI consciousness in high school for a philosophy class, we actually talked about cases such as DeepMind's AlphaGo and IBM's Deep Blue, and how just in 19 years, the process of using computers and AI and machine learning to be humans at games that seem so innately tied with human intelligence. I always thought this was a really interesting thing, and then I really wanted to read about what the human's perspective on that would be. So yeah, I'm really enjoying currently about halfway through Kasparov's work. And yeah, for those of you unfamiliar with Kasparov's significance in the canon of AI and machine intelligence, in 1997 he was the first world champion of chess to lose a chess match to a computer under standard tournament conditions, defeated by IBM's supercomputer Deep Blue. And the way he looks at it in the book isn't just, he goes through a lot of the technical aspects, because he's always been a large proponent for how can machines and computers kind of change fields, especially in terms of sport or in terms of like creativity. Like, this is something he's really interested in. And instead of rejecting it, as some of his predecessors and peers did during the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, but when questions of how computers could be brought into the world of chess, there was a large, understandably so, as there often is with change, there was a large backlash and a lot of discussion as to what this would result in for players. And there were lots of show matches and exhibitions held. He not only talks about the technical developments that allowed for the fateful day in 1997, but he also talks about how if we're introducing computers and AI to areas such as competitive sport, how we need to consider the fact that there is such a psychological element to so many of these discussions and competitions. And when you look at any kind of competition setting or competitive environment, there is such a mental fortitude needed, often in order to succeed or to avoid being the one to capitulate first. And obviously, when you're going up against like a supercomputer, there's no element of nervousness or anxiety or even external factors like being shocked by a noise or snapping out of concentration. Those of his peers who were fearing the technology, those of his peers that were encouraging the technology and embracing it, I thought that was a really interesting perspective to look at the whole sequence of events from. In the end, Deep Blue, which is characterized as brute force computing power as opposed to artificial intelligence, did rely on calculations and pattern recognition. And yeah, looking at the way that this contrasts with the development of Google DeepMind's AlphaGo, which 19 years after Deep Blue's competition match against Kasparov, AlphaGo would go on to beat the Go world champion Lee Sedol in a highly publicized match, and demonstrating how AlphaGo, which was developed instead by combining machine intelligence and neural networks, marked a significant milestone in AI development. In the similar kind of vein to what I was discussing previously, learning about these comparisons between human and machine intelligence has been super interesting, and it calls back to how I got into the topic, which is how computers think and how we think, and how those two fundamentally differ or have similarities at the same time, and also looking at machines' ability to learn, which will segue nicely into our topic for this episode. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask Daria a question in terms of, well, for a bit of background, as I was reading this book by Kasparov, I kept on thinking to myself, what would be the result if two perfectly accurate, equivalent strength, advanced chess machines went against one another? And this is purely from a science fiction interested point of view, but if these two went against one another, would it result in a stalemate each time, or would white always win because of the inherent first move advantage?
What my initial idea is that it would end up in a stalemate or in a draw. Because if you're having two equally trained, equally statistical, supercomputers, they would just end up predicting each other's view and trying to find new strategies until none of them would lose and they would end up in a draw. Although, from a statistical point of view, it would be that most of the cases, in 70 to 90% draws or stalemates. But it also would depend on what opening strategies each computer would take. So, the only variable we would really depend on would be whether the computer starting strategy would be different and unusual in most cases. And therefore, it could possibly have been a mistake and it would lose the game. Otherwise, it would just end up in a draw.
Thank you so much for explaining your point of view on it, Daria. And I think it'd be a really interesting thing to find out more on. And what I really liked also in Kasparov's book is he did talk about this distinction between Deep Blue's brute force computing, figuring out every single potential option for strategy, and then comparing that to if we're able to have these computers that are learning from themselves and learning from their previous actions. And that segues very nicely into today's topic of conversation, which is reflective AI. So, as we said in the introduction, today we are going to be talking to our first guest on the InnoEthics Live podcast. So we're sending a huge thank you to Sofia Baxter, who's going to be explaining what reflective AI is and its place within the landscape of AI development.
Hi, I'm Sofia. I'm a third-year undergraduate student studying computer science at the University of Exeter. My dissertation that I'm doing this year looks at whether reflective AI can help overcome the public goods dilemma, essentially exploring how self-monitoring and reflection might encourage more cooperative behaviour in multi-agent systems.
And we were really excited to have Sofia on the podcast because, talking to a fellow student who is further ahead in her journey with understanding different aspects of technology and AI, so therefore wanting to hear her insight. And also, just having a chat really about some really pertinent and fast-moving issues in this field of reflective AI. So once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for introducing yourself. And to kick things off, Daria is going to start with some technical questions about reflective AI.
Yes. So my first question would be, in this timeline of AI development, moving from simple chatbots to agentic systems, where does reflective AI really sit in? What was the breaking point that made it necessary?
So I do think it's really important to discuss this in a kind of AI timeline, because you then kind of see why its development was necessary and how it fits in. So you mentioned simple chatbots, and these were obviously way back in the beginning, kind of pattern matching systems that have no learning or adaptation. They were kind of just if the user prompts this, respond with this. And then we developed machine learning systems which had neural networks and these deep learning to recognize patterns from like massive amounts of data. And these were much better at specific tasks like recognizing images, generating text, playing games. They're still like operating at that level of just taking inputs, processing them, and then producing outputs. Then, as you mentioned, agent architecture. And these are systems that are more goal-driven and they plan and they can learn from feedback. A lot of them are called BDI agents, which is belief, desire, intent. And kind of similar to like utilizing neural networks, they mimic human reasoning to kind of operate in more dynamic, unpredictable environments. And then reflective AI, I think, just takes us one step further, where these systems can actually start to reason about themselves, their actions, the consequences of those actions within social and ethical contexts. Instead, like, they can start thinking, wait, should I really do this before I act? And what are the effects if I do this? And so I think it sits at that juncture where AI transitions from just being a tool and doing tasks to being more of like a system that can reason about how and whether to do those tasks in more complex human environments. From my point of view, I don't think there was this like massive breaking point that kind of needed its development. I think it's more just a fundamental problem in current AI with just the current limitations that we have. For example, in 2018, Amazon tried to develop their own like AI recruiting tool to help with like hiring. And they trained it on their historical data of who they've hired in the past. And from hearing that, you think like, oh, of course, like use their historical data, it'll all be fine. But because in the past women aren't really in technical roles, it very quickly learned to discriminate against women and penalise resumes that had like the word women's in it. So if it was like women's head of this, like immediately penalised. And that system just had no way to step back and think, wait, is this fair? Does this align with like Amazon's company values? So there's like a flaw there. Similarly, an Alexa told a 10-year-old girl to stick a penny in like a plug socket as like a challenge because that was going around like social media at the time. And obviously we immediately recognize that as being super dangerous, but for the AI, like it doesn't have that common sense check, and it was just going off of, you know, its massive database and what was popular at the time. And I think now that these AI systems are increasingly doing things that used to require human minds, they're doing it in a really strange, incomplete way. And these sort of failures reveal what a lot of researchers call an unusual divorce of accompanying mental qualities. And in a paper I read about reflective artificial intelligence, it uses this metaphor of like this example of if you're playing chess with a child. For us, if we're going to play chess with a kid, we're not just thinking about the most optimal move, which is obviously what AI would do. For us, we think about like, will this move teach this kid something? Is this going to be too discouraging? Are we balancing like challenge with enjoyment? We bring a lot of our human qualities like patience, empathy. We're thinking about long-term goals. We reflect. And so I think that was just the next step for AI.
I really love the examples that you provided, especially the one with the Amazon AI about not involving women in the hiring process, because we just had this episode a month ago about bias in machines, which really shows that people are seeing that bias as a big issue and moving towards resolving it. What can you say about some other unique problems that reflective AI can solve that maybe LLMs, large language models, struggle with? So you already mentioned the Amazon example and the Alexa one. Where would you see the primary impact in technical accuracy or in user development?
So I think there's a lot of issues with LLMs that reflective AI can help with. One of these is this like, can I, should I question. So LLMs generate statistically likely outputs based on patterns in their training data, and they're amazing at that. Like, they just answer the question, can I generate a plausible response to this? What they do struggle with is, should I respond this way given the broader context, the values at stake, and the potential consequences? And so reflective AI introduces a learning loop or a governance loop which can evaluate the proposed actions that it's going to suggest. And it's the difference in like being able to do something and deciding if they should do it. You know, AI currently has like output filters and refusal mechanisms and topic block lists to try and like safeguard. Whereas with reflective AI, it can kind of reduce the reliance on some of these if they can think wider and like, is this maybe the best response? Is it safe? LLMs also have a temporal coherence problem. And this is where they're basically stateless. So each conversation that you have with AI or ChatGPT, like, either starts fresh, like you have to generate a new chat in ChatGPT, and you get given a set amount of tokens. So they don't have this evolving self-model or a persistent values that they develop over time. Whereas reflective AI is designed around this notion of like hexis, which is your state of character that you develop through your habits and practices over time. It has this ability to track your evolving commitments, notices when your actions align or conflict with your values. So it has this kind of identity-aware reasoning. And similarly, it's the difference between asking, like, what is the optimal response right now to, is this action consistent with, like, who I am, who I'm trying to be? The final one is, there's obviously many, but a kind of value alignment problem. So current LLMs, their values are handled during their training through techniques like reinforcement learning, through human feedback. So you do a correct thing in your training, like you get a reward, and that's kind of how they learn. And these values are baked into the model during the training phase. This means that they're static once they're learned, and you can't really learn new values itself without like human aid going back in. And it also isn't very good at reconciling competing values or deliberating when they conflict. Whereas reflective AI, again, implements these learning loops where they can discover and integrate new norms and values from its environment. And therefore, it has this ability to learn through its own like observation, making it way better at deliberating whether values are competing, and it can weigh trade-offs rather than like defaulting to whichever was strongest in its training. I think that the primary impact is definitely more towards the user development end, because technical accuracy isn't the problem that LLMs have. Like, they're already incredibly accurate at pattern recognition, information retrieval, text generation. If you look at the failures that I mentioned earlier that motivated like this research, Amazon's hiring AI like was technically very accurate. It correctly predicted historical patterns. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that like it perpetuated this bias that doesn't align within the context of Amazon and the organization. Alexa accurately retrieved that penny challenge from its database, like technical success, but major judgment failure. And yeah, I think every single one of those examples is a user development failure, not a technical accuracy problem. Yeah, so I think that those governance loops, they're not there to improve technical performance. They're there just to ensure that the system supports value-aligned decision-making.
You mentioned that reflective AI is different from LLMs because LLMs just produce a probability, while reflective AI also think whether it aligns with the values of the person typing with them, and also if it's ethically correct in the world. For example, we have different prompts that LLMs shouldn't answer, right? So would it be too technical to get a bit more into how this reflective AI does that?
In my research, there's tons of different ways that you can implement reflection into AI. The way that I'm doing it is through an example of this like reflective governance loop. And it works as I have a baseline reinforcement learning agent, and then on top of it is a second layer in its architecture that takes into consideration the environment. And if the baseline agent's actions conflict in a harmful way with the environment, then that reflective governing layer overrides it completely. So it's kind of reflecting on its context and the environment that it's in, which a normal reinforcement learning agent doesn't do. They just think about their optimal response from their training.
So you mentioned that you're doing your thesis in reflective AI. What drew you to this niche, and was there any specific limitation in the current AI systems that motivated you to focus on this self-correcting or reflective capability?
So I had no idea what reflective AI was until this summer. Like, it was not taught in my curriculum or anything. But over summer, for obviously your dissertation, you have to pick a topic and a supervisor, and they send you like a massive list of all of the supervisors in the department and topics that they're interested in and would be happy for you to work on with them. And the majority of them were looking at AI and its applications in different fields, mainly like medical fields and sports science. And I wasn't very interested in that. And then there was one on reflective AI with sustainability. And I obviously had no idea what that was, but I was like, oh, that sounds like something I can learn about. So I emailed the lecturer and she sent me a bunch of reading materials. And one of them was this main paper called Reflective Artificial Intelligence. Right from the start, in the introduction, it describes AI as computers that do the sorts of things our minds can do. And as a result, it then went on to question, like, what can our minds do? Can we replicate them? Which part of ourselves do we want to include in these models? And it then discusses, like, when we build AI systems, we're having to make these conscious choices about what to include and what to leave out. And we've gotten really good at replicating problem solving, pattern recognition, information processing, those kind of like computational aspects of intelligence, because we can measure them with benchmarks like loss functions and training algorithms. But reflection, self-awareness, moral reasoning, context judgment, like, these are much harder to formalize. They're difficult to measure, and so they've been left out. And not because they're not important, like, these are so integral to our intelligence, but it's just so difficult to implement. And throughout my like previous 2 years at uni, like, everything I've studied has been taught in like a very technical aspect, obviously because it's computer science. But when you talk about AI systems with moral reasoning capabilities, you then have to confront like these philosophical questions of like, whose morals are we encoding? And that whole philosophical side, like, I've never had to think about ever. And within like the introduction of this paper, I was like, whoa, this is something completely new. And yeah, like, I just never had to think like that before. And even though that's not what I'm tackling with my dissertation, like, just the topic and conversation around this new technology, I found super interesting.
And I think that question of how we're going to be like coding ethics into machines, which is something that we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast, and generally when we're having conversations about ethics of AI and AI governance, like, the idea of how we're going to be putting into machines something that feels so abstract and like immaterial, but we understand due to our our existence, living in a society with other people, living in a certain context with like moral principles that feel almost innate to us, but are so hard to translate to something that isn't having that same contextual experience and lived experience, is something that when we first started talking about having reflective AI as a topic on our podcast, we were like, this is a fantastic way of merging, like, really trying to find like a solution to this question of translating and coding ethics. And it'd be really interesting to see where the field is going to continue to go.
And I also think, like, when you start hearing these thoughts of like, oh, we're giving technology more human-like properties, like, if you don't research into that and learn what's actually going on, it's really scary and like not something I want to hear. Like, so I think there was also that side of like, oh, this could go really south, like I hope it doesn't, and I would love to learn more as to like how that is not happening.
I really love that people finally dove into this direction of technology and AI, because it is true that where the world is going and how AI and LLM specifically are working currently, it doesn't fully look like a good direction. So with reflective AI, I'm really hoping to see like a positive change, like finally. Let's continue with our next question. Can you walk us through a specific project or maybe experiment where you implemented the reflection loop? Like, what were the before and after results of adding that reflective layer?
The title of my dissertation is Can Reflective AI Overcome the Public Goods Dilemma? So imagine you have a group of agents and they all share access to a common resource. This is like the public good. Every round, each agent faces a choice. You can either contribute some of your wealth to maintain this public good, or you can free ride and hope that others contribute and maintain it for you. If you do contribute, it costs you personally. So in my scenario, you have to pay 10 tokens, but this contribution helps replenish the public good. However, because this good is accessible to every agent, they have the ability to free ride by not paying the cost and still getting the benefit from others' contributions. So individually, as an agent, free riding is always the rational choice. The problem, however, is that if everyone free rides, the resource decays. And in my model, it loses 2% of its value every time step. So without enough contribution, the whole thing collapses and nobody can benefit from it anymore. And this is important because it maps to real-world scenarios like climate change, overfishing, groundwater management, situations where individual rationality can lead to collective disaster. Before I implemented the reflective loop, I had to have like a control group. And I just used a baseline reinforcement learning agent to model the scenario. So each agent can observe two things at each time step: its own wealth and the level of the public good. Based on the state of both, they can choose to contribute or free ride. As a result, these agents quickly learn to free ride, and they do this within like a few thousand episodes, because one agent starts to free ride, which reduces the public good slightly, which makes the contribution less valuable for everyone else, which triggers more free riding, and then the environment collapses. One of the reasons why this happens is because of that temporal discounting. You know, these reinforcement learning agents value immediate reward way more than future rewards. So free riding is that immediate benefit without any cost, only showing up later. Another problem these agents face is credit assignment. So when the public good collapses, it's really difficult for an individual agent to attribute that collapse to its own actions. If there are multiple agents in the environment and the effects are delayed, so instead of saying, oh, I should have contributed more, they learn everyone else free rode, that caused the problem, which just like reinforces their decision to free ride. So my hope, which I'm trying to do now, is that a reflective governor would help and prevent this. As I mentioned earlier, the reflective agent has this dual layer architecture, and each layer operates completely independently. So the first one is this base layer, which is the exact same as that baseline agent that gets rewarded purely for maximizing its own personal wealth. And then on top is that reflective governor layer, and this sits above that base policy, and it applies a fixed rule based on the collective state of the environment. So that base policy, that first layer, is going to propose an action, whether to contribute or free ride. But then before that action gets executed, the governor checks the state of the public good. If that public good is below a set sustainability threshold and the proposed action is to free ride, then the governor intervenes, it overrides selfish action and forces a contribution instead. If the public good is above the threshold, so it's still replenishable, it's not decaying too much, or the base policy has already chosen to contribute, then the governor lets that action through unchanged. And this allows the agent to observe not just the immediate state, but the broader context of the collective environment and all the other agents' actions. Where traditional solutions to this public goods dilemma, they tend to use external mechanisms, such as like punishment systems, reputation tracking, reward shaping, or centralized regulation, reflection provides a way of achieving that sustained cooperation without the need for external enforcement. And those dependencies of the current methods we have, they really limit the application and the scalability of current solutions. So with this reflective layer, it can help in decentralized environments and also like huge environments that are massively scaled. So it makes it more applicable.
Sophia, that is genuinely so fascinating and sounds like such like not only very interesting but super, super relevant and applicable to our like everyday society and questions of like politics, economics, and how like using AI and looking at AI can have like going to be having a really pertinent and I don't say impactful twice. And looking at how AI is like so applicable to like real world scenarios and what like using it in real world scenarios, especially like in this case reflective AI, could really have like a positive impact overall. And thank you so much for explaining your project to us, because that just sounds genuinely so fascinating.
Super impressive work. Now it's time for Allegra to continue with some more philosophical questions.
Yeah, so as we segue from obviously your project having like a really interesting like political and economic angle to it because of its like societal relevance and the context in which these could be applied to real world scenarios, looking at more of like the ethical side of the topic of reflective AI, I wanted to first ask about how reflective AI can often bridge the gap between machine logic and human thought, especially when we're considering how like we're trying to put this like contextual moral understanding to a machine. However, at the same time, what would you say that the potential ethical risks of an AI that can quote unquote simulate self-awareness or introspection? And is there a risk that maybe this will over-automate human thinking or thinking for oneself?
Definitely. This was so interesting for me to think about because, like I mentioned earlier, I'm never thinking about the philosophical implications of AI because I think it can be pretty uncomfortable when you like delve into it. Because it's definitely becoming increasingly embedded in our daily lives, and it's reaching some of our most private and introspective spaces. You know, people use it for like therapeutic dialogue, personal journaling, their own emotional processing. And you know, those are spaces where our reflection isn't a tool, it's how we form our identity and our values and meaning. And so when AI simulates this self-awareness of introspection, I think there is this risk that we begin to like outsource our inner voice. Reflection is something, for me at least, that is like oftentimes uncomfortable and super difficult to do. But you know, that struggle is like how we learn accountability, we develop our moral judgment and begin to like understand ourselves over time. If AI starts doing that like interpretive work for us, telling us how we feel, why we feel it, what that means, I do think we will start to become very like passive in our own self-discovery. I think reflection is a very core part of what makes our intelligence trustworthy. You know, we trust each other because we can reflect, we can revise, we can feel doubt and take responsibility. I think if AI systems start simulating this reflection without actually bearing the responsibility and moral stakes, we can very quickly like risk confusing this appearance of trust with the real thing.
No, definitely. And I think when we talked about like options such as like AI companions or like people using AI for therapy or like you were saying, personal introspection or personal reflection, a big worry is that, this over-trust of pre-reflective AI, like people are not understanding that it is like a machine. It's a mathematically data-driven machine behind like the being that you think you're talking to. And therefore, what I really enjoyed earlier when we were talking about why the like statelessness of like LLMs, for example, is a problem is because like, again, it's simulating the fact that there is some sort of trustworthy being behind the screen that you're talking to, when in fact it's like you're saying, like when you type something in ChatGPT, like it restarts all over again. Like it's not like a being that has like learned from previous conversations you've had from it, which is where they're going to be like navigating like the shift from this kind of previous what was happening with LLMs to like something like reflective AI. So yeah, I think that like consideration of making sure that there isn't almost like too much trust put into it, I think is definitely really interesting. And at the same time, like reflective AI, we need to reflect as well. It's important like we're having that same reflection too. But yeah, and I think that segues nicely into like talking about the reflective layer of these AIs, because my next question was, what specific events or aspects of current AI models have led to the consideration that a reflective layer was the next step for AI?
So, as I mentioned earlier, like there are multiple limitations in current AI, but as these models are becoming more capable, you're kind of having more serious issues with them. Like, obviously, we're aware of AI hallucinations, especially in the scaling of LLMs. They can sound so confident and be so wrong. And hallucinations and context loss just shows that just using this kind of pattern prediction isn't good enough. They need to be able to evaluate their responses to, check their own credibility. And I think as a user, people are becoming more aware of AI's inaccuracies. We start asking these models to explain themselves, to kind of evaluate alternative answers and revise their outputs. That's kind of suggesting that like reflection is something we're already using to evaluate the trustworthiness of current AI. And so, they're not fully equipped to respond to these questions yet. As a user, this is something that we feel we already want AI to do. And so I think people are realising that and thinking this is beneficial. There's also something called emergent behaviours. And these are capabilities in AI systems that arise unexpectedly out of scale. And these behaviours aren't explicitly coded, but they emerge from complex agent interactions within a model. And because they're not programmed, they're inconsistent and they're poorly controlled, because the systems have no way to recognise or evaluate these strange behaviours that kind of just like crop up. So by adding self-monitoring through reflection, the systems can notice when these behaviours appear and assess whether they align with their goals or values to kind of stabilise the system. And again, like this is all just helping AI become more applicable in large, complex environments, which is obviously where it's heading.
No, definitely. And like you were saying about we're already wanting it to be reflective, because at the moment we realize like, wait, certain LLMs, they are sounding very confident when they're talking about some information, is when people started being like, wait, can you source that? Or when they started adding like automatic sourcing to LLMs, people asking for the resources, where people have found that, because we aren't designed to, even just like evolutionarily speaking, we're not designed to just take things that like value. Like we want to learn and understand why things act a certain way, where information comes from, the reliability of it. And therefore, yeah, I think that provides some really interesting insight into how it became the next step. Also, as we were talking about previously in terms of how we could use reflective AI to mitigate some of the current limitations and problems that arise from current use of AI such as LLMs, in the example of a user giving a malicious or harmful prompt, would the reflective layer be tricked into justifying the harmful output? Or does it have the ability to distinguish this and flag it as unethical or immoral?
It can definitely be tricked. If we model reflective AI on human reflection, we also model it on like our human flaws. And I think we are really good at rationalizing harmful behavior. We oftentimes work backwards from like the conclusions we want to reach justification for things we know are wrong. And so I think if a reflective AI system is prompted in a certain way, especially by someone who like understands this, then it could just lead to reflect itself into justifying harmful outputs. But there definitely are some benefits. Like, reflective AI is much more transparent because it's designed to explain its reasoning. You can see the justification process, whereas current AI just like generates an output and maybe a short explanation, but it doesn't like explicitly tell you how it got there. If reasoning's part of reflective AI's architecture, like, yes, it can be tricked, but it can very clearly like audit that and you can see the steps. It also can take in multiple perspectives. Reflective systems are designed to consider multiple perspectives before acting. So even if it is tricked into justifying something harmful from one angle, you would hope it should flag conflicts when viewed from other perspectives. And like, I do still think AI safeguarding should still 1000% be in place, but I do think that this is still better than the current alternative. I think that a reflective system that can be manipulated but explains its reasoning is more correctable and more trustworthy than just a black box system that produces harmful outputs with no reasoning at all.
So basically what you're saying is that AI is in the turning point rather than being immoral, as we've framed LLMs in previous episodes. It's actually becoming ethical and moral.
I mean, again, I think it's that problem of like whose ethics and whose morals, but I think for laws and things that are pretty set in stone, like dangerous and serious harmful things, I do think we'll be able to think about the wider environment. Like, maybe I shouldn't tell a child to stick its hand in a plug. Like, maybe that is actually harmful and dangerous and not just a fun thing to do.
And I think Daria's point as well, what we've also framed, an AI hallucinating, for example, it's not being malicious. Like, it's giving a form of output that it thinks is the best type of output it could give in order to give an answer, because it would rather give an answer rather than say like, oh, actually, I don't know the answer to that. And therefore, like, this isn't like an immoral or unethical behavior per se, but in the consideration of reflective AI, as you were saying, with providing justification will help people look more specifically at how like AI, at least how we on the show, is that it's more like aethical, it's amoral, it's kind of like neutrally to it. And what is causing these harms is the way that it's being used, the data that it's being given, that isn't necessarily like diverse enough or isn't the best quality of data it could be being trained with, for example. And therefore, yeah, this like aethical aspect as opposed to like not being ethical or being unethical, which I think, yeah, the justification that the reflective layer brings.
And I think it's also just way more engaging. Like, a lot of the times you ask for something and it gives you an output. If reflective AI can talk you through its each step and its each stage and why it's making these like complex decisions, you know, you're kind of becoming more active in that output because you're having to engage with it and you're also thinking through the steps it's taking and you can evaluate it at every stage and it's encouraging you to do so instead of just like getting your response and taking that at face value.
Yeah, rather than just being like a passive receiver who's not considering it. And for our last question, I wanted to ask, looking at how we're going to be integrating and how AI is becoming more and more integrated into different aspects of society, if an AI can reflect on its own limits, does that make it a better like partner or agent to help humans, especially in high stakes environments such as medicine or law?
I think so, yes. Reflecting on its own limits can make AI a significantly better partner for humans, especially in those high stake domains, as long as it's like bounded, honest and actionable. In fields like medicine and law, those dangerous failures don't really come from a lack of knowledge, it's more from like overconfidence. These current models we're using that produce like fluent, authoritative answers, like even when their uncertainty is extremely high, that's, I think, the real danger. And a reflective AI that can recognise and communicate its own image, flagging low confidence or like conflicting evidence, gaps in context, can really help shift that human AI relationship from like kind of automation to a more like collaborative environment.
Definitely. And when Daria and I were making the questions, we were looking back at previous topics we talked about, and including our episode on AI friends and this consideration that maybe reflective AI could create better, like, quote unquote, like partners that they engage with more actively. And also that it isn't just like every time you log in and start a new conversation with an LLM, it has no recollection of previous conversations that were had. Instead, like, would this reflective behavior allow for an elevated dimension to the capabilities and behaviors of AI companions?
I do think so. Without reflection, these AI companions tend to optimize for this immediacy of like, they're super agreeable, they're super responsive, and very emotionally like validating in the moment. And like that can feel very supportive, but it's pretty like risky and shallow because these systems, again, they have no sense of like time. There's no way for them to track like the long-term effects, notice any dependencies, or recognize when its behavior is becoming like unhealthy to the user. And I think by introducing like memory, consistency, self-monitoring over time, an AI companion can like notice patterns. If like a user's repeatedly avoiding human relationships or like seeking reassurance, it can adjust its behavior accordingly. And instead of maximizing that engagement, it can prioritize like user well-being, boundaries, and growth. And in that sense, it kind of like enables a bit more care and not just conversation. But again, like raising ethical flags, that does make it more persuasive and more emotionally legible. And I think that's when people can definitely like get the risk of attachment or like authority creep. I think that's why they need to be explicitly designed to like decenter themselves and encourage human agency. They need to foster real world relationships and moments of withdrawal instead of just like that constant presence. Definitely doesn't make them any smarter. And I don't really want a reflective AI companion to like feel any warmer either. I kind of just want it to be responsible, and instead of like going for emotional depth, more of like a moral restraint and the ability to know like when to engage and when to challenge and step back.
And just as a follow-up, because something you said in that answer, I'd love to hear your opinion if you actually think this is feasible, because obviously at the end of the day, let's take AI companions, LLMs, they're being created by often big corporations who have a big monetary incentive to wanting to keep users engaged as much as they can with their chatbots, which is why they do tend to be created constantly validating the user's feelings, or if they're not necessarily validating the user's feelings, like providing like some sort of like space where the user will just keep on using and typing and communicating with this LLM or AI companion or whichever. So therefore, let's take the scenario where the reflective layer meant that the system instead thought, actually, we're noticing some quite what seem like potentially harmful behavior patterns. Potentially it's best that like the system like doesn't use its usual tactics of keeping the user on the screen as long as possible. Will developers and companies want to be considering that? Or is there a trade-off between potentially like people preferring a lot more the use of AIs that have the reflective layer? However, then there's also that trade-off that potentially these companies might not get the same like engagement from like a financial incentive point of view they previously were having.
I do definitely think that this is like computationally feasible, and I do think organizations will be able to do this and develop like fully fledged reflective AI that you can interact with. But like you said, I just don't see these big corporations ever thinking like, oh, I really want to market this product that's just disencourage users from ever interacting with it. But yeah, at the same time, if you are putting out reflective AI to help with like these high stakes environments, or even just like as a new ChatGPT, I think like when I use AI, I'm never thinking, oh my gosh, let me use it to be my stand-in therapist. Like never. I'm using it from like purely an academic standpoint, and I think similar like you are as well. But there's a whole other group of people that like that is what they're doing. and they're spending so much time on it. So there is like a massive market for these people to want an AI companion, but I just don't know if organizations are ready to meet that demand with ethically responsible one that says like, hey, you should seek out the help from a real human.
Thank you for your answer, because when we were talking about the way that it could decide actually what's better for the user right now is to just detract and to stop engagement, it immediately made me think that this is one of the massive limitations at the moment with having therapy apps where you do talk to an AI therapist who originally, some of the ones that they tried launching in the last couple of years, which none of really which have taken off or have had to shut down for a combination of regulatory, legal and governance reasons. These apps were saying, stop, log off, go for a walk, go talk to your friend, call your mom, call your dad. They weren't prioritizing user engagement to just keep the user on the app nonstop. I think having the like reflective layer to like this kind of like chatbot, like a therapy chatbot, could be a really interesting and potentially impactful way of trying to move past what previous limitations of using like AI chatbots in therapy could be, because there'll be that understanding of actually right now having this conversation with this system is not beneficial to the user. Let's suggest XYZ. So I thought that would be a very interesting, like having a feasibility of it, but also like considering like, is this something that could, from a financial point of view, actually take place?
So basically, from what you said, companies that are only pushed by the monetary incentive, or like at least that's their main focus, will most likely not dive into using reflective AI in whatever business they're in. But which domains will this reflective AI be launched firstly?
I'm not like 100% sure, but I always just think probably the easiest place to start, I want to say, is just like academia. I think it'd be really valuable and good to develop AI that can, you know, you can ask it an academic question, and instead of giving an output, it can talk you through its reasoning, say why it thinks this, and you can have like more of a discourse and discussion. Again, instead of having to constantly generate like new tokens or start a new chat, you can keep a deep and insightful conversation going with it. For me, that would be the most valuable, and I hope that's what's developed first.
Also, it's fairly low stakes compared to some other sectors, because like you're not really considering things that are, in the case of healthcare or law or finances, like there's less of a time pressure that's adding any sort of stakes to it. And on that note, we've reached the end of our questions and we're coming to the end of this episode of InnoEthics Live. And we just wanted to say a massive, massive thank you to Sofia for coming on the show with us. It's been lovely having you and hearing about reflective AI and all the potential capabilities of it, including both the technical development side, but also the ethical considerations about how it can be implemented into different aspects of society. So once again, thank you so much, Sofia.
Thank you for having me.
Our first guest, very exciting.
Thank you everyone for tuning in and hearing our first interview of the InnoEthics Live podcast. Thanks to Sofia for coming in as our first guest. And we hope that you enjoyed this different version of our podcast. Stay tuned for next week when we discuss about facial recognition and deepfake.